Ovo je Kafe Politika podcast, gde razgovaramo o politici u Srbiji, odnosima u regionu Zapadnog Balkana i savremenim međunarodnim problemima. Dobrodošli u Kafe Politika na šolju Amerikana, deo podcasta u kojem naši gosti govore o izborima u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama i američkoj spoljnoj i bezbednostnoj politici. Ako želite da saznate ko će pobediti na najbitnijim izborima u svetu i kakva će biti budućnost američke politike na Balkanu, ovde se možete upoznati sa najnovijim trendovima. Sa vama su naši eksperti koji vam omogućavaju najnovije uvide u svet Amerike, Milan Krstić i Stevan Nedeljković.
Dear friends, welcome to another episode of our podcast Amerikano. As you can hear, this episode will be in English, and the reason why we will talk in English today is that we have our special guest, Mr. Filip Bekman, Public Affairs Counselor from the Embassy of the United States of America in Belgrade to the Republic of Serbia. It is great pleasure to have you today with us, Filip. Welcome.
Hvala vam, drago mi je. And it's good we're speaking in Serbian, or this would be a very short or in English, or this would be a very short podcast.
Next time we will speak in Serbian. Yeah. but this time we will stick to English, and I would just like to briefly introduce to our listeners. Mr. Bekman is a career diplomat serving for already 20 years. For the U.S. diplomacy, and he has a great career, and he has already served here in the region previously in Slovenia. Currently he serves, as I said, as a public affairs counselor in Belgrade, and in the meantime he was working on various interesting duties in the U.S. diplomacy. For example, he was a recruiter in the State Department, which means that he knows what you should have as a skill and as a knowledge in order to become a diplomat, not only in the United States, but generally speaking, all over the world, considering that the U.S. diplomacy is one of the most successful and most efficient. So I hope that our listeners will carefully listen to all of the things which our today's guest is mentioning and take notes in order to become good career diplomats, since a lot of our listeners are actually currently studying IR with an aspiration to become a career diplomat. So without any further ado, Mr. Bekman, what are the main elements of the U.S. public diplomacy in Serbia, since that is that is the field for which you are in charge of at your current position?
Yeah, so the embassy's public diplomacy efforts are incredibly diverse and wide-ranging. If you have to sum it up in just a few words, you'd say for public diplomacy, we do press, we do exchanges, we do education programs. But in reality, we do a tremendous amount in many, many different areas. So it's as wide-ranging as our exchange programs, which send Serbians, whether they're in high school, all the way up to mid-career professionals, to the United States for experiences that range from a few weeks to a few months to a year or more. We have a tremendous number of small grant programs. And so with those, what we really try and do is bring together Serbian and American organizations to work on interesting projects that are of mutual interest. We also support projects for civil society. Our Democracy Commission has run for years and years, working on important issues like media freedom and human rights. We have many English language programs. So, of course, the United States, we work in English, and it has become a global language. And so we have English language fellows and English teaching assistants who are actually scattered all around Serbia, which is fantastic, not just here in Belgrade, but all the way from Subotica down to Novi Pazar. So we do that. We've got American Corners. There are 8 of those all around the country to make sure we have a presence not just here in Belgrade, but in all parts of Serbia. We've got a university partnership program, right, which focuses on our relationships and building relationships between Serbian and American universities. And we're so proud that the Faculty of Political Science is a really big part of that, and that we've had a lot of cooperation in the past and up to present. So we do a tremendous amount. I should say we also do kind of traditional embassy public diplomacy. That's things like press work, right? Where we have our ambassador or other representatives of the embassy out talking about explaining American foreign policy and talking about what our priorities are. So it runs the spectrum, and it's an exciting job, and I always say it's the best place to work in the embassy. It's the most interesting. You don't know who you're going to meet every day, whether it's a Supreme Court justice or a famous journalist or editor or a high school exchange participant that just got back from the States and wants to tell you all about the crazy experience that they've had. So it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of fun to do that job here in Serbia.
Amazing list of duties, and it sounds really fun, and I'm really glad to hear that you said that it's good to do that job here in Serbia. And one of the elements of the US public diplomacy recently was also the campaign Vi ste svet, which got big attention. So can we just briefly discuss this campaign? What was the main intention of this campaign, and do you think that it was successful, and are you maybe planning similar campaigns in the future?
Yeah, sure. Well, Vi ste svet it did get a lot of attention here, and we saw that a lot of folks were talking about it. Some positive, some negative. But ultimately, the goal of that campaign is the goal of the embassy, which is to improve relations between the United States and Serbia. For that campaign, we were really trying to focus in on the values that we share, and in showing respect to Serbia. Whether it was the portion talking about Nikola Tesla or Mihailo Pupin, who are both incredibly well-known and sort of famous examples, or other contemporary, less well-known folks like Charlie Simic or Walt Bogdanich, the famous New York Times investigative journalist. These are really great examples of a cooperation between the United States and Serbia, and examples of areas where we share values, whether that's the value of a free media, or whether that's the value of somebody like Charlie Simic, who went to the United States as a kid and then became the nation's poet laureate, arguably, a position filled by the most eloquent and thoughtful person in the entire United States. So I think all those examples were really great ways to showcase the ties between our countries. That's the goal, and we'll continue to do that through all our different programs.
Considering that you have mentioned your all different programs, I have to proudly say that I'm an alumnus of some of the programs of the US Embassy here in Belgrade, and to highly recommend to all of our listeners who are currently studying at any level, undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD, to apply for tremendous opportunities which the US Embassy offers for programs such as Fulbright, etc. And since we're discussing the US public diplomacy, somehow I'm thinking about the potential for Serbian public diplomacy towards the United States. So do you think that there is also potential for a successful Serbian public diplomacy campaign in the USA, despite the fact that Serbia is a relatively small state? You have once mentioned in one of your interviews that Serbia punches above its weight, this is the quote, in culture and sports. So are these two fields the most important asset for Serbian image management abroad, and in specific in the United States of America?
Yeah, I think both of those are good opportunities for Serbia. Part of the interesting thing about being a diplomat representing a really big country like the United States is you walk in the room and everyone knows something about the United States. They already have an opinion about the United States. They want to tell you what they think. So that can present, there are certain positive aspects of that, and then also challenges. It's kind of a different scenario for a smaller, less well-known country, right? You get a chance to present what you want to, and you get a chance to really not just shape the narrative, but build a narrative about what's important about your country, what your country's values are. So sometimes I'm a little bit jealous of diplomats from smaller places, maybe places where you get to be the kind of living embodiment of that country and the sort of make the first impression. I think Serbia has tremendous opportunity to make positive impressions and to have positive public diplomacy efforts in the United States. In so many ways, the people-to-people ties are really, really strong. There's such a long history of connection between the two countries through people. To me, those are the most interesting stories because they're the most authentic stories. And so I think that there are plenty of great opportunities to talk about history, but then also to talk about contemporary successes in the United States. And so when the two-time NBA MVP is from your country, yeah, absolutely, you should talk about that. It's a great way to teach Americans a bit more about Serbia, and it's not a bad thing to be dominant in basketball. So why not? Because you've got to find ways to reach people, and that's not always through policy or politics. Oftentimes, the thing that can reach people is something related to sports or the arts or culture.
And do you think that the negative image from 1990s is still alive in Serbia, negative image, in the US public, or it's possible to overcome it, or it's already vanished?
I would say the United States is a place that's very forward-looking. And so I think that I think it's a good place to talk about the future and future relations. And so if I were working on this topic on public diplomacy for Serbia and the U.S., I think I would follow that cultural inclination of the U.S. to look forward and to look for opportunity and partnership and cooperation. So I think probably more often if you hop outside of the Washington Beltway or New York City, okay, Chicago has a huge Serbian diaspora community, so maybe let's exclude Chicago. But if you went to my hometown and said, what do you think about Serbia? My mom would say, gosh, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, she'd say, my son works there. That's amazing. You know it. But the average person would say, gosh, I don't know. Tell me about Serbia. What should I think? So again, it seems to me an opportunity to really shape a positive narrative about how our two countries can work together.
Oh, thank you very much for these great advices for Serbian public diplomacy. And just to come back briefly on the US politics, so this autumn we will closely follow midterm elections in the United States here at the Faculty of Political Science. And our listeners will have an opportunity to follow on our webpage, Amerikano.rs, which is also supported by the US Embassy in Belgrade. So can you tell us what the election day for midterms looks like in your home district, since you have just mentioned your hometown? So how the election day looks like?
Yeah, I know you. I know there are a lot of U.S. election fans at the faculty, and so I know you guys probably could speak just as well or probably better about elections in the States than me. But Michigan's an interesting state. 10 million people. It's not our biggest. I think it's the 9th or 10th biggest state. And it's a traditional battleground. Michigan is sort of in the political world famous for Reagan Democrats, right? Who the state sort of shifted. We didn't say red-blue back then, but to use that terminology, it shifted into the kind of Reagan category. The suburbs of Detroit basically was full of Reagan Democrats and got Ronald Reagan elected and then resoundingly reelected. So what will it look like this year for the midterms? Well, I think the conventional wisdom, like always in the midterms, is the opposition party will do very, very well. But I don't know. I think that recent political developments in the states, particularly around the Supreme Court, have been interesting. We'll see how that galvanizes support from the Democratic Party, and I think it'll be really, really interesting. the last election, the runoff elections in Georgia were fascinating, right? I mean, we've got a state in the deep South, and both the senators are from the Democratic Party. So things are divided really, really evenly, which means there's always a chance for almost any outcome. When I think of my home district, so my home representative in mid-Michigan is Alyssa Slotkin. She's, let's see, I think she was just elected this past round. She's got a tough election ahead of her because it's a very evenly divided district. So yeah, we'll see. It should be kind of fun. Michigan is actually, our two senators are both Democrats, but our House constituency, 14 U.S. House representatives, is split evenly. 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. So we'll see how it goes. I think if I had to make a prediction, I'd say the Republicans will do well because that's traditionally what happens in the midterms. But I'm not so sure.
Well, we'll see, and we will follow also forecasts before the election day for all of the states, and hopefully we will have an opportunity maybe to discuss these elections in our following podcasts before the midterm election day in November with you again. And before since we are near the end of our today's podcast, before we finish, I have one last question for you, which is maybe the hardest one so far. So, but you have to be honest. Is Belgrade a nice place to live in and to work in? As a U.S. diplomat in the public affairs field, of course. And can you just compare it to your previous destinations in which you have worked so far?
Well, boy, tough question for the end, right? No, one of the great things about being a diplomat is one of the hard parts, but also one of the great things is you get to live and work in a lot of different places. So you're not just visiting as a tourist or even as a student for a semester, but you really settle down and develop roots in different communities. And over the years, what I've learned is to pick up the very best things that you like in each place and maybe leave behind the things that you don't, right? And hopefully you can find good things everywhere you go. And I've certainly found that. The reason I keep coming back to the Balkans is I really like this region. I think that the issues are extremely interesting, but I also love the quality of life and the culture and the people. And so to me, that's what's made living and working in this part of the world so much fun. So yeah, I think it's a great place to work, live and work. It's a great place to be in the public diplomacy field because it's a challenging operating environment. This is a tough place to talk about public opinion, particularly of the United States. And so has the delightful benefit of being both a relatively easy and interesting place to live personally, but then also having a really enriching professional work to do. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to be here.
And what are, like you have mentioned that there are always some pluses and minuses. So what do you think are like the biggest pluses of life in Belgrade from your point of view as an American?
Good question. Well, I think Belgrade is it's a really vibrant city. I mean, I've lived in a lot of small towns, to be honest. Sarajevo is fantastic and the history is interesting. Ljubljana is gorgeous, and sometimes I wonder if I'll ever live in a place where you can be to the mountains in 30 minutes to ski or down to the coast in an hour. Amazing. I'm a little jealous we're not closer to the coast.
Me too.
That's something, walking along the riverfront, it's not like being on the Adriatic. So each post has had some things that have been really interesting. But what I'd say about Belgrade is that it's big city and it's vibrant. It has all the wonderful things that big cities have, whether it's diversity of food options or tons of different cultural opportunities. And it sort of feels to me like a place that still has a little bit of edge. It's still not a place that I keep running into tourists everywhere, and that's kind of nice. There's like how would you say this, like a level of authenticity here that is pretty cool. So I've enjoyed that, but really, I'm still a newbie. I've only been here about 8 or 9 months. So ask me that question in 3 years, and I'm sure you won't be able to stop me from talking.
Thank you very much. I hope you will be our guest again in the podcast sooner than 3 years from now.
Let's talk about elections. My last job, I was living and working in New Hampshire, so
wow.
That was a fascinating experience to see the first primary state and during the elections. So that'll be next time.
Wow, that would be very interesting for our listeners and for our followers, especially considering that, as I have already mentioned, we are planning to follow all of the aspects of the midterms, especially in the following months, from August to November. So thank you very much again for being today here with us, for being a guest in our podcast. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. And the next time we have plenty of issues to discuss as well, plenty of topics such as which skills and what knowledge is necessary for a successful diplomat, elections, New Hampshire, as you have mentioned, and of course the US and Serbian relations, especially in public affairs domain. Thank you very much once again for being our guest.
To be continued. See you next time.
To be continued. Thank you.
Hvala što ste slušali Kafe Politika podcast. Ostanite uz nas.